This video is for American government, highlights for pages 168 to 174. On page 168, we're continuing on with the amendments here. Amendment 5 deals with criminal proceedings. It reads, "No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or in public danger." So deciding how and where criminal proceedings will be charged, and identifying the cases that will be given to the martial courts. So highlight, bold term, capital crime, and highlight that this is one so serious that it's punishable by death. No ordinary citizen can be accused of a capital or otherwise serious crime or a felony before a grand jury considers the evidence and decides if it's sufficient for the person to stand trial. So we talked about the grand jury. Remember, that's the group of people who get together to decide if there's sufficient evidence for an actual trial. So the grand jury investigates accusations against the person, and then the trial jury hears the case and issues the verdict. Find the bold term court-martial, highlight the definition for it. Members of the U.S. Armed Forces are tried for crimes in special military courts, each of which is called a court-martial. And if a serviceman is found guilty in a court-martial, he can appeal the verdict in the U.S. Court of Military Appeals. So there's a whole separate court system for the military. Okay, skipping over Amendment 6 and Amendment 7, highlight Amendment 8 and highlight excessive punishments. You want to know this amendment and what it prevents, what it saves us from there. The amendment itself reads, "Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted." So bail is the amount of money that a person accused of a crime deposits with a court in order to be temporarily released from jail. So if the accused doesn't show up for the court date, the money is forfeit. So it does not prohibit civil government from executing criminals, whether by hanging, firing squad, electrocution, gas chamber, or lethal injection. But it does, it's hard to say what exactly is cruel and unusual punishment. People who are against the death penalty, they'll say that any form of the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment. Of course, as Christians, we would say, the Bible sets the precedent of capital punishment. It was one of the very first laws handed down to Noah himself by God. And the Bible gives us the principle of, if any man takes a human life, his life is forfeit. So there's some disagreement on that, but there are still places where they are executing the death penalty. Turning to page 171 now. No highlights on page 170. We do have an in brief of the Bill of Rights, so you can read through that as you're doing your actual reading, and just be familiar with that and what the Bill of Rights sets up for us. Let's look at some of our other amendments here. Highlight Amendment 13. So we're on to the other amendments. Remember, the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments. The rest of them, 17 others, have been added to the Constitution. So the 13th Amendment was 1865. Highlight what it was. It was the abolition of slavery. You'll want to know that. Highlight also Amendment 14. For Amendment 14, highlight civil rights. Very first thing there. This was established in 1868, and it granted citizenship to Black Americans. So they were free, but now finally they were full citizens with voting rights. Turning to page 172, highlight Amendment 16 and highlight income tax. This was established in 1913. And this was when Congress started laying a tax on personal incomes. Highlight Amendment 17 and highlight popular election of senators. Before this, senators have been chosen by state legislature. Now with this, it would be popular vote by the voters in the state. Highlight Amendment 18 and highlight national prohibition. Highlight the definition of this. The amendment prohibited the production, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages in the United States. See a picture there of authorities pouring a barrel of illegal liquor into a drain during the Prohibition era. So there's a whole bureau of federal authorities who would go around checking on people who were breaking the Prohibition laws. Prohibition was pretty, no, what's the word I'm looking for? People didn't support it a whole lot. When people want to drink, they're going to find a way to drink. Hence, speakeasies, illegally made liquor, corn liquor, or moonshine, as they call it, was pretty common during this time. It could be made cheaply, and those who made it could make an awful lot of money from it. But there were a lot of blessings. The use of alcohol did decrease considerably. Broken homes were mended, so men who were spending all their money on alcohol, not working, maybe even beating their wives and children, a lot of those problems were fixed. But eventually, it was unfortunately overturned. Interestingly, if you remember, president that we called JFK, John Kennedy, his father made most of the family fortune during Prohibition, and he was what was called a rum runner. So he would illegally bring alcohol from Canada, anchor the boat just off of American waters and international waters, and then smaller boats would come out from the harbors to the large boat in international waters. They'd load the booze onto the little boats, and then they'd sneak back to shore, and they made a lot of money that way. Next amendment to know is Amendment 19, highlight women's suffrage. So now in 1920, women were finally given the right to vote. And it took 40 years for this to be passed. Amendments giving women the right to vote had been unsuccessfully introduced to Congress for 40 years before this one was finally passed. So it took a long time, but finally, women were actual citizens. Next, highlight Amendment 21 and highlight repeal of national prohibition. So that's pretty self-explanatory. This amendment repealed or canceled the 18th Amendment. So Prohibition lasted about 14 years until this repeal here. And the consumption of alcohol rose alarmingly. By 1948, the United States was reported to have almost 4 alcoholics for every 100 people. There was a rapid increase not just in alcohol abuse, but also in drug addiction, psychiatric cases, divorce rates, and overall instability of the family. So really a bit of a tragedy there with that 21st Amendment. Right, turning to page 174, last thing to highlight is Amendment 27. And highlight the italicized words there. This amendment placed a restriction on the power of Congress to raise its own salary. So if Congress did vote to raise its own salary, the salary increase would not go in effect until after the next congressional election. So there's a good chance that people who had chosen to raise their salary would not be reelected, especially if the raise made their voters unhappy, so they wouldn't get to see any of it. So it discourages them from raising their wages too much. All right, that's the last of the highlights for this chapter. If you have any questions, make sure you contact me and let me know. Have a great rest of your day.